Hi scholars, the purpose of this video is to give you some feedback and also to offer you some follow-up to help you put our first seminar texts in context in this class. All right, I think I told you in class that Plato wrote about 500 years after we think the text of the Odyssey was assembled. And he's writing into a context that had been very much influenced by Homer, and that kind of really viewed Homer and Homer's vision of what makes life good as kind of authoritative. Okay, so people really thought that to be a hero in the way that Homer thought Odysseus was a hero, they thought this is really what would make life good. Okay, this is the kind of person who we want to have as king, right? And really, this is Homer, the Odyssey is a story about what kind of person makes for a good king, right? It's a person who acts with Athenian wisdom, a person who is tactical, a person who is battle wise, a person who is who has that kind of practical skill, right? Not only the know-how of battle, but also the know-how of shipbuilding, the know-how of farming, the know-how of all the things that Odysseus would need in order to rule Ithaca well, which goes everywhere from like knowing how to farm sheep, right? He has a shepherd, but you need to know how to rule a shepherd, right? So you need to know just enough of sheep rearing in order to know that you're not being lied to, for example, because you shouldn't trust anybody because you're tactically wise, right? So this is Homer's view, and this is very much kind of like the context in which Plato is going to write later on, okay? And his views, and my hope is to help you see by the end of the quarter that his views really stand in pretty stark contrast to the views of Homer. And if, I mean, it gets even worse than that, but in some ways most of his work is a critique of trusting Homer to tell people how to live. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's a good kind of general place to start. Okay. I'm going to call this video 729. Seminar 1 follow-up. You should be taking notes through this discussion. My goal for us is to be able to see how Plato's allegory of the cave, which we read for a seminar, fits within his broader pursuit of kind of trying to help people understand what makes life good. Okay? So we'll begin just with this. Let's draw a couple other pictures here. We'll get to these later on. Okay, we'll begin just with the allegory of the cave, right? We got these people. They're chained to the ground. They can only look in one direction, or their heads are chained to the wall so that all they can see are the shadows that are being cast, right? And below the shadows, a horizon, right? Nothing but the horizon. But that horizon is actually, it's not actually a horizon, right? It's a shadow being cast by a wall behind them, but they can't see that wall. All they can see is the wall in front of them. And they also cannot see that there are these people kind of behind the wall who are carrying artifacts that are casting the shadow, right? So this artifact here is like a little statue of a tree, so that when there's like a fire, it says there's a fire behind them and above them, like up here somewhere, right? The fire shines the light casts the shadow, and then there we are. That's what we've got. So it makes the world to them, it makes it look like there is this, like, that what's real are these dancing shadows on the wall, right? Plato's eventual goal in the big book that this is a part of is to really put on display for his audience what would make life good. What could make society good? Here we have a little society, right? There are all these people down in the cave, right? They have their festivals, right? They've got the little games that they play when they try to sort of predict what will come next, right? Well, it's tree, then it's moon, and then it's like the pig comes by, and then after the pig it's like the dragon, and then after that it's the tree again, and then it's the moon, and then like they follow in a pattern. So they try to predict like which one's going to come next. So they have their festivals. They've got their games that they play. Some people are really, really good at those. Like they're like the champions, right? Even you might say they are the heroes who kind of know the way the world works and can kind of like awe everybody else with their knowledge. Okay, with their knowledge of kind of when the shadows come, because their memory works better. So they're able to kind of like do this. Okay, for Plato, this is a sad way to live, okay? And he actually thinks that in some ways the world around him is people trying to live their lives basically just in response to shadows on a wall. A shadow on a wall is fundamentally an imitation of something more real, right? Well, what other thing is Homer's Odyssey except the imitation of something more real? Right? That's what a story is. A story is a bunch of shadows on a page that aren't actually somebody's life. They're like literally like a copy of somebody, or like the attempt to produce a copy of something out there in the world, right? So they're kind of like a shadow being cast. Plato, on the other hand, thought that the world, and this is something he says elsewhere, he says this in one of his letters that he wrote. We think he wrote it, may have been written by a friend of his, but he says, "The world will have no rest from evil until philosophers are made kings, or kings philosophers." And later in the Republic, he makes an even more kind of maybe initially confusing claim that I want to try to see if we can see how these things fit together, okay? He says, like, if you could get somebody to go through this experience where like they study philosophy for their whole life, they eventually are able to come to not just like shadow puppet wisdom, right? Not just wisdom for how the shadows dance, but actual wisdom for why the world is the way it is. That those people should be made kings because they're the only ones who know what life is really about, right? But he says, like, left to their own devices. He says, the philosopher king lives 729 times more pleasantly than the tyrant. And that's it's kind of an oddly specific number, right? Like 729, really? Like you can calculate exactly how pleasant someone's life is and compare it to the pleasantness of another person's life. I mean, I know they measure like the spiciness of hot peppers, but that is even this, like that at least you can measure with a chemical, right? Like this is crazy. 729 times more pleasantly than the tyrant. And in his mind, somebody who's a tyrant, okay, this word comes from the Greek word tyrannus, okay, which just means the ruler, okay? So the difference between a philosopher king and a tyrant is only this for Plato, that the philosopher king has gone through the education to learn about the way the world is, whereas the tyrant has to be in charge of society but without the benefit of education. And so that's like trying to run society with only the knowledge of how the shadows dance on the wall, right? Like inevitably you may get one right every now and again, but you won't ever know whether you're actually making life good for the rest of the world. You may know whether you're making it seem better for yourself and better for your friends, but you won't actually know whether you're making life good. Okay, so to kind of unpack that a little bit more, like how does he arrive at that number, 729 times more pleasantly? And also, like, why is it that the world will have no rest from evil until philosophers are made kings or kings made philosophers? Sorry, my... that always happens. Okay. Okay, so let's walk through like the stages of education. I think we'll see something more about the text if we actually just like put this up in front of us, okay? So the person who like lives in the cave, right? They begin there and all they see are shadows. But then you force them to turn around, right? Like to turn their faces around, and then whoa, right? What they see is this little the word that he uses is artifact, or we might call it statue. Right? They're like little puppet versions of real things. And the first experience that somebody would have of this, right, is pain. Which is kind of the twofold pain of like, first of all, it's the pain of looking at light for the first time in your life, right? That's hard, that's painful, and that's difficult. It's like, you know, like looking at your phone in the middle of the night. That is a physically painful experience. So there's the physical pain that person has to go through, but there's also the deeper pain, right? The pain of like having to expand or somehow alter your understanding of what a tree was, right? Because like his entire life, this is a tree. And now like actually this is a tree, right? So weird, right? He has to be able to say, okay, I can kind of connect my earlier concept to this thing, but like this is obviously more real and more substantial and there's more to it. And so I have to go through that mental shift, which is a painful experience. It's even worse, right? It's worse than the physical pain, or maybe it's more difficult. I don't know if it's worse, but it's certainly it's more difficult, but more rewarding though too, because like now that you know what a tree is, like you're in a way better position than those people who are still sitting on the ground, right? But it's not over for our poor schlep, right? Because we're going to take them up to the surface. Remember that they're also at the back of the cave. There's this staircase that leads up to the surface, right? So we're going to take that person, once they've got their eyes adjusted to the light at the back of the cave, the light that's being cast by the fire, we're going to bring them up to the surface. And when they get to the surface, like, again, ouch, right? More pain, because, like, they had gotten used to what light was. but what you're putting them in front of is so different, so much greater, so much more intense, right? This is like Nycterus's response and Photogen's response, right? Like when Photogen first sees darkness, he just collapses, right? And this is the same for Nycterus, like you just collapse. And he says, and I'm here on page 188 of the Republic reading, in paragraph, like right at the end of paragraph 515, so right near that 516. Let you flip there. You can pause it. Okay. And if someone dragged him away from there by force, up the rough, steep path, and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light, with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of those things now said to be true? Right? Like when he comes into the light, he can't see that anymore, right? And he also can't see anything that's on the surface because the light is just too bright. It's just too much for him. And Glaucon says he would be unable to see them, at least at first. So Glaucon kind of knows the person he's talking to, the person Socrates is talking to. Like he would need time to adjust. I suppose then that he would need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first, he'd see shadows most easily. So then, like, the next thing he can see is like, oh man, we're back to shadows, right? It feels like we're losing ground here. Except we're not really losing ground, right? Because this is a shadow cast by, like, an actual tree, maybe. That's why I drew it laying down, right? Imagine there's, like, an actual tree here. Ta-da! All right. And then, after that, like as he got adjusted to this, right, which is like surrounded by way more brightness than he ever was able to see before, then he might be able to sort of see a little bit more about the world. Plato says the next thing he'd be able to see is like images of things reflected in water, right? Images of people, images of objects, and he'd be able to see maybe the sun and the stars reflected in water, right? So he might be able to like, okay, I can kind of like barely look at the sun reflected in, like this is my little pool of water here. Okay. And he might be able to look and see like, okay, here, like this thing that I thought that a tree was this, but actually now I know that the tree is this. Like this is somehow more real than that, right? So he's slowly adjusting to what a tree is. And then Plato thinks, well, if a person was able to adjust to that for a long enough time, then like maybe they'd be able to sort of see an actual tree. Ta-da! Right? See objects themselves. And then they might be able to also see... They might also be able to like look up and see like the sky, right? That would be the next thing for them to be able to look up first at night, right? They'd be able to look up and see the night sky, right? Peppered with stars maybe. And then they might be able, after that, given enough time to adjust, they might be willing or able to see like the sun itself, right? And remember, like in each step along the way, there is a moment or there's an element of this that involves the pain of adjusting to a greater light, right? Adjusting yourself to more light and more light and more light, and also like different light, right? And then, so I'm just moving down on page 188. After he's able to see the sun itself in its own place and be able to study it. necessarily so. And at this point, he would infer and conclude that the sun provides reason, the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things he used to see. Okay, so our next transition after he's able to see the sun and like watch the way it moves is actually to begin to see governing patterns, right? That the world above, in the same way, I guess, that as like the world below moved with a predictable series of patterns, the world above moves with a predictable series of patterns. Spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter. We don't usually think about the fact that like somebody had to figure that out. Right? So, and then like when we were really young, somebody explained that to us, but at some point people had to actually experience the world and like figure out, okay, summer is always followed by fall, always followed by winter. Well, or wherever they first figured the seasons out, you know. But then also that like the stars move the way they move for a reason, right? And the sun gives light, and that causes light. It causes life to grow according to a predictable pattern, right? Like when the sun is hottest, life grows more, and when the sun is not as bright, and the planet cools off, right? And we might be able to sort of make these observations and start to discover why the world is the way it is. And if you can begin to discover that, like if you can answer why is the world the way it is, right? For Plato, like this question, why is the world the way it is the beginning of the process of looking for the greatest light. Okay? It's the process of looking for the final, like the ultimate sun. Okay? It's not the like the sun that we see in the sky, but it is somehow like the light of the sun of the sky. If that makes sense. Or like the cause of the light. What is the true, like what is the light of all the other lights, right? At every stage along the way, here's our like our person's first experience of the world, right? The first thing that happens to them is boom, their 2D world becomes 3D, and they discover for the first time that what they took to be just obvious, right? That the world has this color. Actually, that color is cast by the light at the back of the cave, right? So they discover that there is a light which lights their world. Whoa. And their world expands. And then you take them up to the surface. And if you like orderly notes, you're going to really hate the rest of this video. I'm sorry. You can put this on a different page if you want to. Okay, so boom. You take them up to the surface, and their world expands again. It expands in a literal way, but it also expands kind of like in a mental way, in a different way, right? And they have to discover that in this new world, there is a light, which is somehow like unto, but also greater than and different than the light which they had known, right? This is like Nycteris going out and always having to discover the greater light, right? But then, like, if you discover like the way the planet works, right, or you discover the sun and you're able to see the way it works, then it's like when you've discovered the reason why the world works the way it works, it's like you've discovered kind of like an even greater light. A cause, right? A reason why the sun moves the way it moves. A reason why the planets move the way they move. A reason why, right? Which is in some way a cause of the things. And then you'd have to ask the question, like, well, why is that, son? Now you're like, you've learned the question, right? Like, why is the world the way it is? And you keep asking, like, why? And when you start to chase that why question, right? And you start to move to the greater light and to the greater light, right? That ongoing process of expansion of the world and just moving into a realm with more freedom and more beauty. Eventually you hopefully would come for Plato to the fundamental answer, right? The most basic explanation, right? The most basic reason why the world is the way it is. Okay, and he gives that answer for what he thinks, like why he thinks the world is the way it is. If you turn to page 190. Okay, this is kind of right where he's kind of finally actually defining. He's kind of finally defining education. Okay, so in paragraph 518, he then says, if that's true, then here's what we must think about these matters. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. All right, so at no point along the way, not here, not here, not here, not here, not there, not there, not there, not there, not there. At no point along the way do you teach the prisoner how to see. The only thing you can do is put the next thing in front of her and wait for her to adjust to it, right? And you just have to trust, you have to just take for granted that she will see it because she has eyes for the light, right? Like Nycteris, who has Aurora's eyes. Okay, but our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which it learns is like an eye, which cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This process, right, the thing that is like the thing about you that's looking for the greater light, right? He says it's like an eye. We might call this the eye of your eye. And so this process of like learning to look at the greatest light is what we would call speculative wisdom. It's the wisdom of how to use the eye of your eye. This instrument cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is, and the brightest thing that is, namely, the one we call good. Isn't that right? Yes, and then education is about like helping people learn that they should love this process of turning around, and how we can most easily and effectively be made to look for the greater light. But what he says there, and this is going to get us to this, like, why does the philosopher king live 729 times more pleasantly than the tyrant bit? What he says there is that this greatest light up here, he gives it a description. He calls it the one we call good. Okay, so whatever we mean when we say the word good, that's the greatest light. For Plato, that's the fundamental reason why. Why is the world the way it is? Because it is good for it to be so. Why is it this way instead of that way? Because it is good for it to be so. Okay, in a fundamental way, Plato thinks like the reason, part of the reason the universe is the way it is so that we can try to discover what makes life good. Okay, because we live in a universe that is populated by goodness. And at this juncture, I want to pause our discussion of Plato and just give you a sense of context. Okay, in later history, Christians who are going back to some of the pagan writers, and especially the pagan writers that are important in Western culture, when Christians get to this passage in Plato, and we're kind of like reading along with what Plato has to say, how could we help? But when we get to that, like the one we call good, who is the brightest and who is somehow the cause of all things, how could we help but think of God at that moment? Okay, and so then actually Christians have seen in Plato, most Christians for most of history, have seen in Plato a kind of kindred spirit. Okay, this is somebody who, at least most Christians have thought, if he would have had the chance to sort of get to know the God of Scripture, probably he would have seen that the God that he understood, or like the source of goodness that he understood as behind all things, is the one that we call God. Now people go back and forth on that, and actually one of the reasons why Socrates is eventually killed is on charges of atheism, and we're going to have to look at that when we read the Apology. We're going to have to kind of explore that question. But at least you should know at this point that like Christians, when they hear like the one we call good, Christians, I think we know, or we hope that we know, who is the brightest light, who is the true fount of light and wisdom, right? Okay, so how does this help us see the philosopher king living 729 times more pleasantly than the tyrant? I'm glad you asked. Here's the finishing of my color coding of an answer. 729. Let's see if we can find that number. The person in the cave begins life, and this is their experience, right? And then, whoa, their vision expands. They turn around, they see the statue, and what was for them one dimension has become three. Okay, which is actually more like somehow we have to start there. Like we've gone from one dimension to three. So like, I don't know, 1 times 3 equals 3. Okay, and then as we move up and up and up, what's happening as our world expands and expands and expands and expands and expands is that eventually we get to see the vision of goodness, beauty, and truth themselves. Goodness, truth, and beauty. These are, for Plato, the most fundamentally real realities that there are. Goodness, truth, and beauty. Once you sort of see all of those things, your vision of the world has expanded so exponentially as to be literally exactly 729 times more pleasant than the experience of somebody who has not gone through that experience, because you know what genuine goodness is, you know what genuine truth is, you know what genuine beauty is, and so what can you be but happy? And now Plato thought, like, obviously if somebody saw the beauty of truth itself, or the truth of how goodness is beautiful, right, like the what these things are in and of themselves, they would be like shot through with sheer bliss, right? Because they're looking at the thing itself, the world itself, like what's most really real. And so obviously they're not going to want to go back down to the cave, right? But remember that his goal is justice in the book. So since Plato's argument is that like what would be just, what would make the world a better place, is for people who really know what life is about to be put in charge and to be like helped to rule or made to rule, so that all the people who are stuck down here in the cave can live better lives. His answer to that is like, doesn't that make them less happy if you pull them down into the cave? And Socrates' answer is like, I don't care, because they can help make life good for other people. So they need to not stay on like the beauty of philosophic knowledge. They need to make the descent and show other people what makes life good.